Hello and welcome to Tiger Triangle Technologies. This is session 2 and we're going to jump into the foundations of Grokomatic. Oh, and by the way, I will link to the source code and other resources in the description below. Let's jump right in. When you run Grokomatic, you're presented with a choice of which model you want to use for text generation. So here I have three options: Grok, OpenAI, and Ollama. Grok and OpenAI, of course, you need to have credits on there, so it's going to cost some money. Ollama can run locally, and this again is just for the text generation, not for the images. Before I added this option, I was always using Grok, and so let's choose OpenAI this time. Next, you're presented with a menu, and you can choose what action you want to take next. This time, we're going to post to all platforms, so we're going to select one. It logs to the console and also to a log file. It shows what's used for the system and user prompt, what the assistant's response was for generating the text, and also the image prompt. After that, it'll just go away when it's done, and you can check and see if it's posted to the platform. For instance, we can see that it just posted this 37 seconds ago. Basically about quantum computing in this time is what it chose randomly from my list. And you can see this is just some of the last few I've been testing. Feel free to check out my X, Facebook, or Instagram accounts, and you can see some of these for yourself. Let me know how you think it did. Let's take a quick tour of the Grokomatic application. And this is what shows on screen when you first run it. Welcome to Grokomatic, generate post about tech innovations. And so that just writes out to the console. This is a simple console app. It is .NET 9 and we're using C#. First, you can see that I have the project organized here into different folders. And so we'll look at a little of those as we go. I want to point out one is the data folder, and that contains a couple of JSON files. One that we talked about earlier contains all the data that's going to be used for the post. So here's 45 different technical innovations, and it'll read those in and choose one at random, and after it's posted it'll put it into the completions JSON. That way it won't get duplicated, it'll know it's done. So I guess this is a good time to talk about the models folder. The models work kind of like as blueprints to different objects. We'll create or instantiate an object and then populate it with information or data inside of it. So as you notice, this is called Tech Innovation, and it matches what is in the JSON file here. So what I'll do is I'll read this in and populate a collection of Tech Innovation objects, and that's going to make it easier to use within the C# program. Moving on, there is a configuration section here that's pretty important, and this uses some extensions. So I guess what I'll show is there are some dependencies on packages here. Microsoft has some extensions that really come in handy, and some of those are for configuration and others for dependency injection, which I'll show you shortly. And then we have some other packages here that we'll show you later, but some is just to handle JSON. So let's talk about the configuration real quick. So there's this app settings folder that we're using, and this is where we're holding part of the configuration. So think about data that's needed for the application, and maybe we don't want to hard code all of it in there. This is stuff that can be easily changed in this config file. There's another file that's in the same format and can have some of the same sections here, and that is called user secrets. So a couple questions. First of all, how do we get these values in where we can use them within our program? And that's where we can use the Microsoft extension for the configurations. This configuration builder will bring in the JSON file, appsettings.json. It also can read in other configuration files that are maybe in a development environment, and that's what this variable appears for. If I had a need to have different values, then I could also have one called appsettings.development.json, and then I could read from that as well. I don't have a reason to have these different ones now, but this is just usually how I set this up. It also can read configuration from environment variables directly and from user secrets. So why do I have different places? Why am I doing one in app settings and one in user secrets? Well, you're going to put everything in app settings unless it's private information like API keys and stuff that you don't want to put up into source control and should not be available to the public. And so for that private stuff, that secret stuff, you're going to put in something like either environment variables or in the user secrets. So if I right click on here, we can manage those user secrets. If you click on that, it'll show a file, but it looks similar to this, but it's got stuff like API keys. I'll put a link in the description down there if you want to check that out. All right, another thing I like to add to console applications is a logger. And here I'm using Serilog. Again, that's one of the dependencies you'll see as a NuGet package. I'm bringing in the Serilog for configuration. And there's a lot of different syncs, but I'm using one to write out to the console and to a file. I really like to be able to have these log files like this. So you can write out errors in here and it'll help you troubleshoot. It'll tell you what the error was. Or you might just want to log out information. So I can log out the system or user prompt. So another thing that I like to set up in here is dependency injection. And we're not going to get into much detail about what that is, but we'll talk a little about it. So the services are basically just C# classes that will provide some kind of functionality, right? So we'll look at these later as we use them, but you can just imagine, there's an AI generator service, image service, text service, and that kind of self-explanatory, but we'll look at those later. But those services need to be brought into the application as needed. That's what this service collection and build service provider does. So I have this configure services function. I'll F12 into that to jump into that. What that does is adds these services into a service collection, and it scopes them. Most of them are scoped to have just as needed for the operations. And then there's one singleton that is the same. Here it's the same during the whole application. It works kind of like a static class. And so those services will be automatically injected as. Well, notice that there is a text service that it handles generating that text with artificial intelligence, right? So that's what this service does, calls the API endpoints. And also notice that there's AI generative service. It needs to use that text service. And so since that is in the constructor here, when the AI generator service is created, it also automatically creates the text service. But using that inversion of control or dependency injection, it has some benefits. So, and it just, with those Microsoft extensions, it's kind of built in. Why not use it? So I'm creating the objects for different configurations here, and then I'll call into a method called initialize. What that's going to do is initialize all the configurations, right? So it creates this base path where I want to keep everything, which is in my documents with a Grokomatic subfolder, creates a file name with the current date and time. And then if that directory doesn't exist, it will create it. And it creates a text file that's going to hold the social media post text. And I wouldn't have to do that, but I just want to have that in a separate file in case I want to use it later. The PNG file path is where this image is going to be written out to, that is created from the AI endpoint. And then I'm going to convert that to JPEG to make it much, much smaller. Then I come down here, and usually on my configurations, I like to take those sections and bind them to an object. So that's what these config objects in here are. And it's just going to make it easier to use in C#. And if you wanted to just automate this and not do it manually, not have the menu pop up, you can run Grokomatic and pass in batch. And so I'll show you that here. All right, so this allows you to say if the arguments being passed in is more than 0, then look through those arguments and see if any of them, see if batch was passed in. All right, so if it equals batch, then you're just going to automatically post everything on all platforms. Okay, so it allows you to automate that it allows you to schedule it. If no arguments are passed in, then it comes down and it allows the user to choose a model. As shown here, it says choose a model, Grok, OpenAI, or Ollama, and it uses a switch statement to decide which one the user chose. If it didn't choose any numbers, it'll try to do it again. It'll present this menu again up to 3 different times, up to the max retries actually. So after the user chooses a model, it will show the menu right here. It runs next, which is right here. So it's going to clear the console and create this menu options. So user choice, where does that come from? That comes from up here where it says console read line. So the program will halt and wait for some input. Somebody has to then type something in, and you're hoping that they type in one of these options that you stated in the menu. And depending on that option, it will, if they chose one, it'll post on all platforms, pass in the scope service provider, and then it'll break, so it won't hit any other case statements. Okay, so if they type in 2, 3, or one of these others, then it goes into that section and calls a different thing. Next time we're going to look at the code that generates the text using AI. I hope to see you there.